Okay, I think we are live. Let me just double check. Yes, great. So we will wait a few minutes until more people have come in. I see that the number of attendees is going slightly up, so I'm waiting until it until it stops a bit. Okay, well, just to begin with, maybe I can start with some practical aspects. So I think if everything goes right, I should be saying hi to people both in Zoom and in YouTube. And so, yeah, the event will be live streamed, so it's also available afterwards. So if you're in Zoom, you will see some functionalities at the bottom, like a Q&A where you can post questions and upvote the questions of others and comment the questions of others. And also if you are on YouTube, on the right-hand side of your screen, you will also see a sort of live chat where you can also ask your questions. So we have staff from the journal monitoring also that chat, so they will bring those questions to me during the Q&A section. So we thought it was a good idea to make the Q&A sort of long to enable a lot of people to comment, to ask questions, and sort of really dig down into the issues that we will talk about during the debate itself. Yes, so the idea is that during the Q&A, I will read the questions on the Q&A section here and on YouTube and ask them to the speakers, and they will address them. So regarding the format, it will last about 2 hours and a half, 2 hours 45. And first I will make a brief introduction of the speakers and sort of the motivations behind the event. And then we will move to some opening statements of about 7 minutes long of each of the speakers to the open question of open science rankings, yes, no, or not this way. And then we will move to a question round, which will last 45 minutes. And we'll have 3 blocks of 15 minutes each first on metrics, then on open science and transparency, and finally on academia in general. Then we will have some closing statements by each of the 3 speakers, and we will have a short break of 15 minutes because it might be a long event. And then we will have finally the Q&A, which will last 45 minutes. And yes, as I said, I wanted to also thank the organizers. So this is an event organized by the Journal of Trial and Error, a journal that I am part of and that I will talk to you about in a minute. But this is an event also organized by the Open Science Community Tilburg, the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University, and the Open Science Community Utrecht. So we're very thankful to the organizers for the support and the sponsor of this event. So now I would like to briefly sort of talk to you about the reasons behind this event and sort of what motivated us, both as sort of the team at the journal and as members of the Open Science community. And I want to tell you why we're hosting this event and why we wanted to have this conversation about open science rankings. As part of the journal, we are a young team that since the beginning of funding our initiative, we wanted to not only help publish negative results and examples of productive failure, but also wanted to be a platform for self-reflection. And we wanted to become a space for researchers to reflect and also pose critical questions on scientific practices. And we wanted to put the emphasis that not only experiments fail very often, but also that the mechanisms by which science, and especially academia, evaluate and assess us fails us as well. So we know that the employment and the evaluation mechanisms of academia, as well as the recognition and rewards cycles, fail the practitioners themselves, often fail the research community itself, and fail the society at large that we are supposed to serve. So in this systemic failure, some of us feel that it is not only a matter of fixing methodologies, but it's a matter of reforming academic culture. And in my opinion, I think it's a matter of bringing value back into science. And so as this part of attitude of self-reflection of the team, we saw the emergence of this debate over how to encourage open science practices, who should encourage them, and what to do and what to think of those that don't take them up. So if open science is good for science, good for society, and good for researchers, why aren't more people doing it? And so we wanted to envision a healthy open science community, one which is inclusive rather than inciting fragmentation, and one where open science practices are built for something rather than for only the sake of open science. And again, this idea of constructing meaning instead of only remaking methods. So given this sort of context of our ambitions, there was something much more concrete that made this debate happen and a reality. As many of you know, there was some Twitter debate that took place about a month, 2 months ago, that I think from our perspective started when the initiative of Curate Science, headed by Etienne LeBel, who is present here with us today, was launched. And as you might have seen, there was quite a lot of debate on social media, some of which seemed reasonable and productive, and some of which wasn't. There were fair and accurate points of criticism, and there were also solid and interesting hopes put into the defense of the project of establishing an open science ranking. So briefly, for those of you who don't know, the Curate Science initiative was a project funded by the ERC, and which uses publicly available data followed by personalized audits in order to establish a ranking of individual researchers based on 3 basic open science practices, namely the percentage of open science, open access publications, the percentage of data of those papers made available, and the percentage of disclosures of conflict of interest. So given the debate and the criticism and the support that the initiatives receive, we decided that this aspect of open science rankings, so this idea of sort of listing individuals according to their commitment to open science practices, needed to be addressed. But first of all, in a much more humane and social manner than what we saw on Twitter, perhaps, and second of all, based on expertise. So in a nutshell, that's what made us think about hosting a live debate with 3 experts from different domains and with different experiences. Etienne is the founder of Curate Science, and he will explain to us why he thinks that this sort of metric and ranking tools are so needed, and why especially now. He has been successful already in translating his mission into concrete institutional support, as Curate Science was funded by the Marie Curie grant of the European Research Council. And Etienne is committed to bringing about social change through science and advocates for open science as the way forward. In a, quote, colossal time of crisis, he says the Curate Science project aims to foster transparency, to be able to distinguish between those researchers who are committed to making a difference from those who hide behind their papers and make their research obscure, thus putting obstacles on the power of science to solve global issues. Curate Science, in Etienne's word, is done, quote, out of desperation. Yes. Together with Etienne, we also wanted to have in the debate as well other experts that could, first of all, contextualize, and second, provide a critical perspective and alternative solution to a metric-based academia. So this is why, first of all, we invited Sarah de Rijcke, who is a professor of science and evaluation studies and director of the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University. Sarah has done work both sociological and historical on the use of metrics and rankings, describing, for instance, how throughout the 20th century, university rankings went from seeking to showcase eminent men to later on promoting a view of excellence, the sort of password that, as many of you have experienced, serves as a rhetorical device to manage limited resources. And most notably, Sarah has done a lot of work on how to develop and use metrics responsibly. In fact, this is the motto of the CWTS, Responsible Metrics. Perhaps her most well-known contribution to the international community is the Leiden Manifesto, which she co-authored with colleagues at the CWTS, and which aims to be a useful resource for guiding metric builders and users on how to assess research responsibly. We will talk more about the Leiden Manifesto and how it relates to Curate Science in a minute. But before, let me introduce the third speaker. Juliëtte Schaafsma brings a critical and outspoken critique on rankings, but perhaps not from having researched them as an object of study themselves, but by being someone who I think holds a clear position, perhaps activist, I would dare to say, on the use of rankings in universities. Juliette is a professor on cultures in interaction at Tilburg University, and as far as I know, she doesn't seem to commit to a single disciplinary boundary, and she brings insights from both anthropology and psychology and uses both quantitative and qualitative tools to understand intercultural interactions and processes of social exclusion and inclusion. But the reason we brought her here today is because I think Juliette is, like many others, concerned with the use of rankings in universities and the resources that are allocated to the so-called improvement of these rankings. Perhaps you have heard of her very serious and clearly non-sarcastic job application for the post of International Rankings Officer at Tilburg University. Juliette published her cover letter where we could read that she, quote, wakes up every day with a head full of sorrow about the world in general and the ratings of Tilburg University in particular, unquote. Scanning, she says she scans the web for QS rankings, the Time Higher Education ranking, among others, and she's worried about how her Tilburg colleagues, especially junior colleagues, seem to prioritize their heavy teaching load, the writing of grant proposals, and student and PhD supervision instead of focusing on bringing Tilburg's position higher on the international ranking scale. But jokes aside, Juliette did remind us of something important in her application, the ease in which rankings can be gamed. Quote, in terms of actual strategies to improve our position in these rankings, I would propose creative strategies such as the use of self-citations, running surveys among students, but removing any negative evaluations, adding new indicators such as the quality of the catering services on campus, and paying highly cited scholars from Oxford and Cambridge to add Tilburg as their secondary affiliation, unquote. This mocking application perhaps reminds us that not only how destructive and pervasive can rankings be, but also how inaccurate and unreliable they can also be. Granted, university rankings, such as the Times Higher Education rankings, are very different from Curate Science Transparency Leaderboard, as the first deals with institutions and Curate Science deals with researchers. But the question perhaps still remains, can a classification of individuals according to a virtuous element ever be corrupted? Or are open science practice always, by definition, a desiderata of science? In other words, are open science rankings a worthy tool that allows us to reward those who commit to virtuous practices and punish those who don't? And thus we should be striving to develop these metrics nationally and globally? Or are open science rankings, by virtue of being a ranking, an inherently corrupt system that will continue to reproduce inequalities in research? Or can we otherwise envision them in another way between this dichotomous neither or? Is it possible for transparency rankings and open science rankings by extension to be used for the public good in a fair and meaningful manner? If so, what are the contexts and the uses in which we can trust these sort of rankings? So just to finish off, I would like to draw on a quote from a Professor Jutta Heider, who I find really interesting and sort of has guided me in thinking about this debate. And in 2018, she published a piece where she analyzed and questioned the concept of openness in open access and open science. And she posed a simple, but I think very insightful question, which is, in a way, the rise of open science perplexes me, and I have to come to ask myself, if science is open now, to what and then how was it being closed before, by whom, or by what? And then she also asked, if open access and open science are the solutions, then what are the problems that they are meant to solve? So with this sort of open-ended questions, and especially with this sort of more grander context of the debate in mind, I would like to pose the question that sort of should kick off the debate. Granted, it is an open-ended question. It has been designed like this because we were mostly curious about how our three experts would understand and address this question. So the question is, open science ranking, yes, no, or not this way? So now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Etienne LeBel to address this question.
Great, thank you. And so I'll start with a story. In 2013, Peter Higgs co-won a Nobel Prize in physics after a Switzerland team measured for the first time a Higgs boson, which is a fundamental particle that Higgs and a few others predicted should exist 50 years earlier. And this groundbreaking work has shed new light on fundamental questions and mysteries, such as how particles acquire mass and even the origins of our own universe. However, in an interview with The Guardian, right before the ceremony, he mentioned that in today's academia, he would most likely not be able to get a job because of his low productivity. It turns out, indeed, Higgs only published 26 papers in his entire career. And as a comparison, the average MIT professor published over 70 papers in their pre-tenure period, which is 8 years. So let's think about this, right? Does that make sense? And indeed, I would say that Higgs' story speaks directly to the most fundamental problem in today's academia, which is its obsession with quantity at the expense of quality. And sadly, we now know from meta-scientific evidence, rather, that academia is in fact in a quality control crisis. And a quality control crisis in terms of a transparency crisis, a reproducibility crisis, and a replication crisis. And so, for example, the transparency crisis, which is probably the most fundamental, is reflected in the fact that to this day, over 90% of all peer-reviewed papers have data which are unavailable without valid justification. And this is evidence coming from biomedicine, social sciences, econ, and psychology. And so, of course, this quality control crisis is devastating for the research community in terms of stifling cumulative knowledge. It's a crisis of ethics and accountability crisis for the profession of science, because we are not accountable if we are not sharing our data without valid justification. But of course, this quality control crisis is even more devastating for the public and the broader society, because in an advanced democratic society, science is the foundational public institution upon which other public institutions are depend on. And so we're talking about the legal system, the education system, environmental issues, public policy, and health. Indeed, most tragically, medical patients are suffering and dying. And so this quality control crisis is costing us lives. So this is not just an academic debate. And so the solution to this quality control problem is to start measuring and tracking minimum transparency of research, because science is a quality control system, but it requires minimum transparency to be able to operate properly. And so when you think about quality, quality in science is the extent to which a finding withstands different kinds of scrutiny, like independent peer review, post-publication peer review, reanalyses, replication. But for all that good stuff to happen, we need minimum transparency. And so in this sense, we can say that minimum transparency is required in science conceptually, definitionally, pragmatically, And indeed, this is why minimum transparency is required ethically, as an ethical duty as part of public funders' codes of conduct. This is already expected from us as a moral, ethical duty. But of course, because no one is tracking minimum transparency, there's no way to enforce these ethical principles, which then allows researchers to do what they want. And unfortunately, there are a lot of rogue researchers who are cutting corners, cheating, and outright fraud, which is on the rise, retractions, and so on. So minimum transparency is required conceptually and ethically. It's not optional. It's not negotiable. But what is negotiable is how to implement such a system of checking the transparency of research and researchers to ensure that it meets a minimum standard, right? So we need to draw the line somewhere. So it might be difficult to draw the line in the sand, but it needs to happen. And our solution in our Curate Science pilot project was to choose the lowest possible transparency standard that's most generous, that has the most generous requirements as a way to start, because the hardest part is to start. And we thought that the most defensible thing to do is to choose the lowest possible transparency standard that still conforms to current codes of conduct by the public funders. And what is also up to debate is who does this checking and how can they remain accountable to the researchers. And our solution for that is potentially to become an accredited, independent, external, nonprofit entity who itself is audited for conforming to auditing systems and to have a transparent, accountable, transparency checking system. And of course, funders should be doing this transparency checking. And I think some of them are listening, so this is good. And some of them are starting. But I would just mention that we still think we need a broader system because not all researchers are funded publicly. And so the funders should be checking this, but it appears we still would need a broader system for research that is not publicly funded. And so in closing, academia's main problem is its obsession on quantity at the expense of quality. And the solution is to track minimum transparency so that science's quality control processes can operate properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Etienne. Nice. I think you touch into a lot of the topics that I think we're going to touch upon, both sort of metric-based, but also larger issues in academia. So we will come back to those. But now I would like to give the word for her opening statement to Sarah de Rijcke, who I think will share her screen with us.
Yes, I should have just done that. Can you see it, Max?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. And thanks for organizing this event. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So some opening statements on this particular question. I would like to mention that indeed the focus of my work and also the institutional work we do is indeed a bit broader than the rankings issue. So it's about responsible metrics, responsible evaluation at large. But I'm pitching this toward the issue of rankings. And as you may know, my institute also has a ranking, the Leiden ranking. So some of the things that I'm going to say actually also apply to our own context and might fire back to our own context. But I'm doing this also for the purpose of debate. So let's go. Yeah, so the first thing I wanted to, and this is also why I'm using slides, because I wanted to flag this article and put the spotlight on Jelena Branković's work, which is quite fundamental in thinking through the issue of the purpose of ranking to begin with. So what she says is, we tend to obsess over the how, methodological issues, what can and cannot be included in ranking, and we should, but it's also interesting to ask the question of why do we do so? Why do we rank in the first place? And for the purpose of today, why would we rank open science practices? So Etienne just gave some context to why he thinks that's smart to do. I wonder if we should also consider some counter arguments. And one is, of course, that a ranking practice is a zero-sum game. So it's a hierarchical instrument. It plays on this cultural imperative to improve, to perform better than others. And it creates a world in which competition bodes well. Who is the most open or the least open at the individual level, which in a way sounds absurd when you think about it in terms of what is open science meant to do. So to treat open science as a ranking and also as a performance-based reputation device, we should probably take a step back and think if we do want to go down that road. So there's an assumption built into this that this type of exercise will drive change, will improve transparency, but I don't think there's actually evidence that it is going to do just that. As Lizzie Gadd famously tweeted once, rankings are only really required in a few evaluative settings, for instance, where there's a prize on offer or a job or a grant. In other contexts, rankings serve no purpose. So this is a moral economy of open science: faster, cheaper, more efficient. Moral because it's connected to specific normative expectations about how science should be and how scientists should act. Efficient, accountable, transparent, and something to also have more of. And I don't disagree with attempts to improve the conditions under which science and scholarship is undertaken and also communicated and accounted for. That's also one of the reasons why we published the Leiden Manifesto. But I do have some concerns about whether open science does or does not become too much of a business model, an accountability tool in evaluation contexts and also in career assessments, and also whether attempts to repair science take into account the plurality of its epistemic practices, so the various ways in which knowledge is made. Max already referred to this piece by Jutta Heider, and she also writes that the notion of competition and acceleration that underpins much of the contemporary mainstream discourse of science, and which is often expressed in terms of various indicators, is applied directly to open science, at the same time as it is framed as a transformation or a disruption of the system, further solidifying this imaginary of open science as part of the never-ending acceleration and economization of society. So in a sense, also a means to win a race, even when it is fundamentally also about working together, and in the broadest sense of working together, also about democratization of knowledge creation and circulation. So that is also, I think, at the heart of the recommendation on open science. And I wanted to share that. So take a step back and see how the landscape of open science is developing also globally. So this will be a standard setting document that the UNESCO produces in collaboration with their nation states, the member states. So a set of overarching principles, shared values, and also key priorities. And I'm also working with them as one of the representatives of the Western European and North American states. And I guess what I would like to just flag is this more inclusive definition of open science that also is about more than publishing. So it's broad, it combines various movements and practices aiming to make scientific knowledge openly available, accessible and reusable, but also to increase collaborations, information sharing, openness to the process of knowledge creation and evaluation and communication to societal actors and beyond the traditional scientific community, including all disciplines, all aspects of scholarly practices, basic applied sciences, also the social science and humanities. So it builds on a couple of pillars that also include infrastructures and communication and engagement with societal actors, as I said, and open dialogue with other knowledge systems. So it's in this framing a truly multi-dimensional concept for which a ranking doesn't seem very fit for purpose. To stress that point, this is also included in the recommendation. So it shouldn't only foster enhanced sharing of scientific knowledge solely among scientific community, but also promote inclusion of scholarly knowledge from traditionally underrepresented or excluded groups, and contribute to reducing inequalities in access to scientific development infrastructures and capabilities. And that capabilities issue we might want to come back to in the discussion, because the playing field is obviously not leveled. So I guess what I wanted to say is don't reproduce past mistakes, including reducing research missions to publishing. We do much more than publish, including reducing publishing to reporting, whereas writing itself can also be an act of doing research, reducing academics to authors, and also reducing authorship to labor on an academic market. And I think I had one more. So those are about responsible metrics. So rankings are not a holy grail, but when we start using metrics, we should do so responsibly. And one of the things that I think we highlight, so these are listed from a couple of initiatives, including the Leiden Manifesto, but also the Metric Tide, and a very fascinating initiative by iNorms, who published in 2019. It's called Rating the Rankers Criteria, led by Lizzie Gadd, and well, a couple of other initiatives. So the measure against the mission or missions, measure performance in accordance with missions of research that may or may not include forms of open access. Humility, also recognizing that quantitative evaluations should support but not supplant qualitative expert assessment. So a word or a phrase like researcher transparency audits sounds very totalizing to me. Base these assessments of individual researchers on qualitative judgments of portfolios, and good governance, something that Etienne also mentioned. So what are the mechanisms for engaging with those assessed through independent international advisory boards, for instance? Context counts. So we should really work towards fostering contextualization, multidimensional and critical reflection. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah, for that. I think also, as Etienne went through a bit of the themes that we will touch upon later. But now I would like to give the word to Juliette for her opening statement.
Thank you, Max, and thank you also for organizing this event. So given that this is a discussion about transparency, let me, for the sake of transparency, share what my initial reaction was when I first heard about the transparency metrics. I immediately sank into a deep depression, and I cried a little bit, and I thought, to be really honest, that there is really no end to the madness in the brave new world that is today's academia. That and a few other sentences that I will not disclose here. I hope that most will agree with me that there are limits to being fully transparent. So transparency metrics, and more in particular, I think the Curate Science initiative, which is meant to verify that research is transparent and credible, I think is anything but a cure. I think it is a symptom. And I think it is a symptom of the mindset that has infected today's academia, where key academic values such as curiosity and autonomy and responsibility and integrity and care and carefulness have been replaced by the logic of business, performance and competition and impact and targets and output and efficiency, and the logic of management and administrators, accountability, control, measurement, audits, and metrics. And under this logic, we are no longer treated as the professionals that we are and should be, who read and discuss and evaluate each other's work in terms of the content and the quality of our ideas and methods. But we have become objects instead, who need to be controlled by an external regime of quantified indicators. And the sad thing is that I think that many academics seem to be largely unaware of the broader historical and political context. The neoliberal political priorities and the new public management ideologies that have led to this, and that we now even seem to have a generation of academics who seem to have internalized this logic and seem to think that more accountability and more audits or rankings or metrics are the solution to the problems that we're currently facing in academia, rather than recognizing that this actually has created the problems that they're trying to solve, including the questionable research practices in some academic disciplines. I think the proposed solution are anything but a solution. Transparency metrics only make a bad situation worse, and I think pervert the whole notion of responsible research conduct in open science. Why? Well, because those transparency metrics undermine professionalism. Responsible research conduct in open science should be part of our intrinsic professional academic standards, which we should be proud to maintain in an open and safe academic climate, in which there is room for discussion and debate and error. And transparency metrics do not seem to depart from or tap into those professional standards. They are more about people's reputation, reputational concerns, and they externalize people's motivation and contribute to a blame and shame culture, or even worse, a surveillance culture, where you either comply or you are distrusted. This is all the more problematic because the metrics are utterly simplistic and reductionist, and as far as I can tell, also clearly developed from one particular discipline, experimental psychology. They're sort of pretending as if there's this one-size-fits-all formula that will do justice to the diversity in disciplines in terms of the methods that are used or the types of data that are used or collected. And they literally reduce transparency to a single decontextualized number, and much to my dismay, even a widget that you can add to your profile, some kind of a badge of honor, which I think doesn't do justice to the intelligence of most academics. Transparency metrics, I think, are not only invalid, I think they're also unethical. Because they link a reductionist metric to individual researchers in public, which is something, by the way, that we would never do with research participants, and pretending this gives information about the credibility of their work. And I think it's particularly young academics who might with untenured positions who may pay the price for this. Finally, I also think that the transparency metrics will be ineffective. I think what we've seen is that, and we've seen that with all of the metrics and rankings, is that they eventually become a target and hence become subject to corruption pressures. People always find ways to game the metrics, which, returning to my point earlier, will also have the effect that they will eventually undermine what they were intended to monitor. So I'm really concerned about those metrics. To be honest, I think that in my department, I will advise people to avoid those types of self audits, I think it is very important that also as you know, leaders in academia, that we encourage people to be transparent, that we encourage people to share their data, that we, you know, encourage them to publish open access, pre-register, but we don't need metrics for that. You know, we need a conversation for that. We need a different culture for that. We need a different system for that. But metrics, I think, are not the way to go.
Great. Okay, thank you. I think we had great interventions by the three of you. I think we at least get a taste of where everyone sort of stands. And yeah, so the idea now is that I'm going to ask some questions and sort of ask one of the speakers to join in that question and give the word to each other to sort of try to see where there is disagreement, right? Because I think maybe some of our audience now appears to see that there is some disagreement and perhaps some agreements between some of you, but I feel like we could get more precise onto where we disagree, and especially where are the alternatives to what all of us don't like, or what at least some of us don't like. So my first question, I think, would be to Sarah about why do we need metrics? What is the motivation between metrics?
Yes, so let me clarify my position. My research is also about studying how metrics came about. So it's a bit more reflexive than defending metrics too cool. So I think Juliette had an interesting point about where these metrics sit or originate. And indeed, I think she's partly right that it originates from parts of the behavioral sciences. So some of these dynamics around how science went wrong and some of the moves toward more openness and transparency definitely sit there. What I've looked at is how scientometrics and bibliometrics came about around the late 70s and 80s, and clearly also tied to the rise of indeed new public management types of governance structures, and how they added a layer of accountability. So for decades now, and started to interact with the primary process of knowledge creation and dissemination. And what I think institutionally, we've also contributed to that. But so my position is that we should avoid simplistic metrics, and we should move to more contextualized practices of using quantitative information. So that is not necessarily metrics only, but that can be more descriptive forms of quantitative data about development in science and scholarship. And that is actually interesting and rich. But if we start to use simplistic measures like the GIF or the H-index or a ranking, then we are in trouble.
Precisely to that question, perhaps I would like to go over it, because we sometimes perhaps maybe have been guilty of using metrics and rankings interchangeably, but I think they are not interchangeably. And I think as what I try to understand what you're saying is that there's such a thing as metrics, which is the act of measuring something, but that if they are complex enough and used in the right way, they need not be dangerous or something that shouldn't be used.
Well, yeah. So what we try to do is also look at the level of analysis and the level in which certain types of information is inserted into, for instance, an evaluation. So usually rankings are about institutional level dynamics, and what we are talking about here is also individual level. Mm-hmm. And that's a completely different ballgame. And the moral issues that come with that are also completely different from when you would use metrics at an institutional level. That said, you can also not do a ranking on an institutional level, but do a mapping exercise or other forms of visualization that would avoid listing in the form of a ranking. And I would much prefer moving into that direction to understand dynamics instead of doing this accountability exercise of who's best in 1 year, because that's also problematic.
Okay, great, thank you. And Etienne, I think had a remark.
Well, yeah, way too many well, I'll just start that. So it is reductionistic, but the basic transparency categories are so fundamental that they are not problematic. I mean, open access is always relevant. Conflict of interest is always relevant, and open data, like the system is designed to be based on the article type, and so open data only applies to empirical article types. So a lot of the concerns are not valid, and you'd have to show counter examples. You have to refute the system that we have proposed, and that's the whole point, is that we tried to be as basic as possible so that these transparency standards apply literally to all papers in all fields and all subfields across all methodology, study types, article types, and career stages. And we did it. If you can find problems, then point out specific problems. But you can't just say, there are these general problems. You have to point out the specific problems. And again, I agree that metrics can be misused. And indeed, part of academia's problem right now is that it started by university having to justify to the governments that their researchers are performing well. So actually, no one's really to blame, but researchers will be ranked based on quantity, which has caused a devastating quality control problem that has been ongoing for decades and decades. We've been giving carrots to people and encouraging them to be more transparent for like 25 years with almost no negligible increase in transparency. And you have to be honest about that. Our open data rates have gone from 0% to about 3 to 6% in 20 years of encouraging people to do the right thing. It's not working. Okay, it's not working. We need to go beyond carrots. But let's be clear, we fully embrace carrots and to actually tailor carrots and personalize carrots to the researcher and their career stage. So I'll leave it at that for now, but there's many other things to respond to.
I just wanted to sort of bring back to the issue of metrics themselves. So I think something that I'm still unclear about, and I think I talked with some of my colleagues at the journal about why perhaps Curate Science was controversial, but why sometimes metrics are controversial, because Curate Science, like other metrics, they use publicly available data to basically, they curate that data, they organize it, and they put it into a specific format. So why do you think that there was so much backlash? I'm asking this to you, to Etienne. Why do you think there was so much backlash for presenting something that was already public? And so in more general terms, are there ethical challenges for working with publicly available data? And sort of basically,
right, so there's dozens and dozens of different reasons, and different people have different concerns. But the primary one is just people are generally against change, right? And the status quo bias is very powerful. But I think the most important factor is that it is the first system to be applied to the individual, and that's and again, that's justified because we are in a devastating quality control crisis, and it's the individual researcher who holds the power, and with power comes responsibility, right? So it's easy to blame the journals and blame the universities and blame the funders and blame everyone else, but it's the individual who has a tenure track professor job. It's the individual that has the prestige and all these other benefits of being a professor, which is a dream job for most people. And so with power comes responsibility, and the responsibility in science is to meet a minimum transparency standard, which is required for science to be able to work. And we now know science is not working. You cannot do reanalyses, you cannot do replications. Half the studies in biomedicine can't even be replicated because there's not enough transparency information, and people are dying. And so we can't just sit around here and talk about these hypothetical abstract problems. These are concrete problems, and we need to try other alternatives than just encouraging people to do the right thing when we know the vast majority of researchers do not do the right thing because the system is flawed. And so they are rational. A researcher is rational to just chase quantity at the expense of quality because that's what they get rewarded on, right?
So yeah, you're right that sort of I think maybe all of us here agree that to a certain extent the system, whatever that is flawed. But yeah, in matter of sort of concrete aspect, and now perhaps I want to ask any of the two speakers if they want to intervene on this question. If the data is public, why is it such a big deal to try to collate it and present it in a specific way? For example, giving a ranking. Why is it so big deal if the data is already public?
Can I add a comment there? Because also to what Etienne said earlier, I think if you present a cure, then you have to be sure that your diagnosis is correct. And I think the problem that we're seeing in today's academia, and I fully agree with you, Etienne, I mean, there is a problem where, you know, the focus is very much on quantity instead of quality. What has been rewarded is output, is, you know, maximizing number of publications, especially in psychology. You know, you have to present a series of studies and they all have to, you know, all your predictions have to be confirmed. So you have to present significant findings, et cetera, et cetera. So there have been a lot of pressures on people to publish a lot and to publish significant findings. There is a whole system that has been rewarding that type of behavior. And I think if you want to do something about this, and if you want to encourage people to share their data, what you need to do is change that system, change the reward system, and change the academic culture. And a key problem, to which I also alluded earlier, in academia is that people's professionalism has been taken away from them. You know, so it has been sort of outsourced. And I think you cannot then say, okay, now we're going to target the individual researcher who we've put in a certain system. And now we're going to target that individual researcher and attach a specific label to that individual researcher that might have severe consequences, and say, well, this researcher is perhaps less credible because, you know, transparency ranking is X. So I think if you want to do something about the current crisis in academia, then we need to address the culture, we need to address the system, and not address the individual researchers by, you know, shedding doubt on their credibility in public, to which they're defenseless.
Right, but how do you change the system? People have been trying to change the system for decades. How do you change a system? A system is just a collection of individuals.
Well, I think
so it's the individual that can change the system, and that's what we're trying to do, right?
No, I think that
and minimum transparency is required to assess the credibility. So actually this speaks to your point. So minimum transparency is not the credibility. Credibility has to be evaluated based on minimally transparent research, right? And so if you don't meet a minimum transparency, that might, the community will decide how much that should tarnish your reputation. But it's clear right now, it's not unethical. I mean, it's in our code of conduct that we're supposed to be transparent. But right now, if you don't share your data without proper justification, you're not going to be investigated. Right?
Let's come back to that in a second. I think Sarah had their hand raised. I don't know if it's regarding this topic or...
Yes, sort of. It's an interesting discussion. I think we should be careful not to be overly generalistic in our statements about, for instance, we have tried to change the system for decades and we have a crisis everywhere and there's a reproducibility crisis everywhere. I just don't think that does justice to the complexity of the issues that we have here. And one of the things that I think we should do is be specific about where the problems sit, what they look like, which disciplines have what types of quality control mechanisms in place. And for instance, the notion of reproducibility is a very obvious one because that doesn't translate or transfer into different disciplinary contexts. If we want to affect change, that's also something that is a concerted effort by funders, by journals, by societies, by institutions, and also by leadership in academia. It is definitely not an individual issue.
So I agree that in trying to sort of pick specific examples and sort of give a specific evidence. And so I don't know, at the end you will have to maybe remind of the data, but I do have data, for example, about a specific desirable open science practice, which is open access publishing. And according to a 2018 study by Pivovar and colleagues, they describe a constant increase in open access publications in the last 20 years. And it looks quite a steep increase. And they add that this trend shows no sign of slowing. And given that this was prior to the sort of Horizon 2020 and some initiatives at the European level to increase open access publications. So there is some evidence that there is some increase in open access publications. Then with this comes two questions. We have specific examples of this crisis, perhaps crisis of transparency, as you called it. And also, what do you think this increase in open access publications is due? Do you think it's due to what you call carrots or sticks?
Well, right now it's only carrots, and carrots do help, and I definitely can agree that carrots have helped a little bit. So open access rates in general are about 50% to 60, 70%. Conflict of interest statements are now up. Again, especially in the biomedicine, 50 to 70%. And so there is progress in the right direction. But for the more important categories like open data, we're still hovering between 3 and 6% in social sciences, 2 to 5% in psychology, and 5 to 10%. I could show the graph based on Hardwick and Ioannidis evidence. And open data is the most critical one, right? And so there is a direction. We are improving in the right direction, but it's a glacial pace where 90% of papers don't have data available without proper justification. So you can't even do your job as a peer reviewer. You can't even properly evaluate a paper, and therefore you don't even have falsifiability, which is the crucial ingredient of science. So even without bringing in the ethics part of it, transparency is required, and so we have to figure out how to do it. It's not a question of whether we should do it, it's how to do it, because again, we are already being evaluated in flawed ways by these institutions.
Let's keep it into concrete. I wanted to take it into concrete examples about like how in the past 20 years, 100 years, or whatever time period you think and all the other speakers think that there's been either this crisis. How can you sort of give us examples about whether things are going for the better, things are going for the worse? I don't know if Sarah or Juliette have examples of this, about how, are open access, open science encouragement working, or are they not?
I mean, there are examples. You, for example, see that universities have concluded agreements on with journals on open access publications, facilitating open access publications. I see a young generation of researchers who are, for whom open access publication is sort of the default, who pre-register their research. You see change at the level of journals who now expect people also to make their data sets available. It's not, I disagree that as a reviewer, you cannot see the data sets. As a reviewer, you can also, I always ask for data sets. I always want to see what has been done. So that's also very common. So it's not that, I mean, and you see that over the last years, things have been improving. Now, obviously it would be great if everybody would share the data to the extent that that's possible. But you definitely see an improvement in the right direction. So I'm not too pessimistic in that sense. I really see a cultural change as well, specifically after I think particularly in psychology or disciplines that are linked to psychology.
Okay, great, thank you. now, also to move something into more concrete aspects, how do sort of open science metrics that focus on individual researchers, right? So like Curate Science leaderboard, relate to the DORA declaration, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment? Do you think they are complementary? Do you think they are in conflict? I mean, I'm not asking here to give a thorough comparison between the two, but there are some declarations by DORA that focus on organizations that supply metrics. And for example, there are some description of these rules. And one of them is be open and transparent by providing data and methods used to calculate all metrics, which I think is something that Curate Science does do. There's another one called be clear that inappropriate manipulation of metrics will not be tolerated, be explicit about what constitutes inappropriate manipulation and what measures will be taken to combat this. And then the last one, that account for the variation in article types and in different subject areas when metrics are used, aggregated, or compared. So I think precisely this last point, account for variability. I don't think, or do you think that any ranking that focuses on individual researchers throughout all science can account for this variability? I'm sorry, I'm asking Etienne about okay. Whether...
Yeah, no, so according to my understanding, the Curate Science transparency rankings are fully consistent with DORA and the Leiden Manifesto. And of note is the gaming issue, which is another red herring. So of course you can lie about your transparency and say, oh yeah, my data's over here, when it's not actually there. But very quickly, the community will transparently learn that you're mischaracterizing your transparency and your reputation will be affected. So of course you can game transparency metrics, but because the transparency is transparent, I mean, if you look at the transparency leaderboard, you can see exactly, okay, the data is at this link. You can click on the link and go see if the data is there. Maybe the data is poorly organized. Maybe it's missing. Right. So yeah, you can game transparency metrics, but it's to your own demise. It's to your own disadvantage.
Juliette,
no, I'm just thinking about ways in which you can game the, I'm not sure if we should have a discussion about that, but I can see ways in which you can game those transparency metrics where, you know, you run a bunch of experiments, you know, you have like a bunch of experiments with non-significant findings. So one experiment with the significant findings, that's the one you publish, that's the one you upload, you have all your data, you know, it's perfect. And people, you know, don't know what, you know, that you've also these other data sets. In that sense, you've also been gaming the ranking. So there are always ways in which you can game those metrics, and in that sense, I think the metrics are to academia what bonuses are to banks. You know, I think they invite people to game the system, specifically if you link it to individuals, and if so much depends on on it.
I guess
again, we're already go ahead.
You could argue that it's an interesting initiative to encourage positive behaviors, and that metrics can play a role exactly because they do affect behaviors, and evaluations do as well. But I'm also hesitant to engage in this discussion about methodological and technical issues related to this particular instrument. Because that also further justifies the fact that it exists in the first place and it just needs sharpening. Whilst I think the discussion we are also trying to have is whether or not it's a good idea to have an instrument in form of a ranking at the individual level in the first place.
Yes, we will get to this later, because it is true that if we start looking at the technical aspects, then yeah, we do assume that it exists, but at least we can assume safely that this idea has been backed by the European Research Council in some way when it has funded the initiative. So we we could see that there's interest by funders by trying to at least understand who is the best open science advocate of their country or of a given university.
Can I say something
Right,
about
and you could briefly respond to a point by Juliette that the gaming system is...
Hold on, let's I think Sarah has a response exactly to this.
Well, so there are other ways in which you would could chart like championship or collaborative patterns, or people teaming up to promote open science practices. And I understand why funders, for instance, are interested in promoting or fostering open science. It's exactly, I think, funders that have the most room actually to navigate and to foster more open science practices. An instrument at the level of individual researchers and a kind of punishing and rewarding dynamic at that level does something completely different than fostering responsible practice. It further creates competitive dynamics that I think we should stay away from when we speak about open science.
Right, but competition will always exist, right? And if anything, you can argue that transparency...
But a statement like that is really, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you do this...
It's going to level the playing field. So competition, there's already hyper competition, and it's been like that for decades and decades. If we all had to abide by minimum transparency, we would actually level the playing field. And so marginalized labs and marginalized groups can better compete, because now the cheaters and the people who are cutting the corners have to think twice about cherry picking and committing fraud, right? So it's already super unfair. The transparency, a minimum transparency, is a way to level the playing field.
I think statements like competition has always been around need to be qualified. That's just not the case. And
in every aspect of society, you can't get rid of competition. So the solution is to make it more fair.
Just so that generalistic kind of problematic statements that need further qualification. So I don't think that is really very helpful.
But one question, perhaps a more specific question, is what do you mean when you say minimal transparency? What's the difference between minimal transparency and transparency?
Well, that's what I was saying about drawing the line. So everyone agrees that more transparency is better than less transparency. But up to now, there's no minimum level of transparency. So Curate Science has proposed different levels. And this speaks to another of Juliette's comments, is that the minimum transparency standard is open access, open data when ethically possible, and conflict of interest. That's the minimum proposed. And again, it's the lowest we could come up with. But higher up, there's a starter standard that then includes open code, open study materials, and an even further standard, which includes open peer review and pre-registration, which would speak to the gaming issue that Juliette mentioned, that, oh, people will just cherry pick their studies, they'll cherry pick. No, those can be addressed by even higher standards. So if you pre-register your studies, it's harder to cherry pick your samples and cherry pick your analyses, right? But we're proposing minimum transparency as a requirement, because again, in science, it's not optional, it's non-negotiable. And so the task is to get together and agree on the specific details of what does it mean to meet the open access standard, and what does it mean to meet the open data standard? What does it mean? Like the actual requirements, right? So again, we can drill down into the details.
Right, but so
we try to be as low and generous as possible, just so that we can start, because it's better to all meet. It's better for the research community to meet a minimum transparency standard that might be too low, than to not have any standard at all, and then you invite all the corner cutters, cheaters, and fraudsters. Which is,
so let's come back to that. But so if indeed these are minimal transparency, minimal meaning that they are required or easy to achieve, there seems to be some tension between how easy they are to achieve and the backlash that the idea of minimal transparency seems to generate. At least seems to be some contradiction, because if you say that they are required, but there's still people who will disagree about this, I think there's something about the main concept of minimal transparency that perhaps doesn't hold much water, especially the idea that without transparency or without, let's say, open access, there's no science. Open access is a relatively new phenomena, and before that, science still existed. But I wanted to draw the attention now, perhaps, to understand what does transparency mean in each other's field. Because perhaps someone who works with data, it's very clear that sharing data is an aspect of transparency, but can we think of other kinds of transparency? I don't know if from your own more sociological, ethnographic fields, Juliette and Sarah, whether you can envision some sort of transparency which cannot be metricized, that cannot be measured and quantified in the same way that you can quantify data.
Could it be the case that this is a word that does indeed not resonate in every corner of the academic spectrum? So I think if you would, I'm not sure, but if you would ask an anthropologist, I'm not an anthropologist, what are important elements of quality control? Maybe transparency comes up, but I'm assuming that they will talk more about doing justice to the collection of empirical material in collaboration with their interlocutors. So there may be an element of transparency in describing how that works and how you should always come back to the informant when you want to share something. But I don't think it's at the forefront of their repertoire when we speak about quality control mechanisms, I think. So it's the same with reproducibility. That doesn't always translate in each discipline as well. That doesn't mean that they don't have quality control mechanisms. And that doesn't mean that we can't intervene to further improve science and scholarship, but we should do justice to the local context and the local quality control terms that are already at play. So I get the feeling that a lot of what we are talking about is actually coming from parts of the behavioral sciences and psychology, experimental psychology, and not necessarily our quality control terms that fly everywhere in the same way.
So yeah, so with that, I wanted to ask Juliette precisely to perhaps give us a feel for what is your experience when you hear transparency metrics or that minimal transparency. How does it apply to your own work? How do you view it? Do you view it as something that you could take up, that you could improve, or does it feel like something that is foreign to your kind of practice?
Well, I think I'm not a good example, probably because I do both quantitative and qualitative research. So, I combine, I'm familiar with what's going on in psychology and in anthropology. So in that sense, I see where the reproducibility and, the need to replicate, I see where that comes from. But I agree with Sarah, it doesn't necessarily resonate with other disciplines. Also, when I look within my own school, the way people collect data, I'm also thinking about philosophers, perhaps historians. That's a different way of creating meaning and understanding the world. And I don't think that those concepts resonate. So I think that's it's also a point that I try to make in my opening statement. I think that the way the whole transparency metrics are being operationalized is really heavily based on what is going on in psychology, and it's very much based on the logic of experimental psychology. And in that sense, it's really highly decontextualized. It will not resonate, I think, in other disciplines. I can't speak for all of the disciplines, obviously, but I don't think it resonates. And it really also the replication crisis. I mean, it's very much in psychology. Now, other disciplines may have other problems, but I think that really biases the discussion as well, and biases the solutions.
Okay, great.
Quick response.
The quick response.
So I agree there's variability in what kinds of scrutiny you can have in different fields. So you can't necessarily do reproductions or replications in all fields, but the core essence of science is that finding a piece of scholarship withstands scrutiny, whatever that scrutiny is for that field. And the transparency metrics we've developed are so basic that they apply to all fields, because if it's a non-empirical article type or even a qualitative article, then the open access and the conflict of interest funding statements still apply. So find me a counter example where open access and conflict of interest disclosures don't apply.
Does anyone want to take this question, or at least address the question in some way or another?
No, I feel I would try to repeat myself. I guess maybe I can add something, and that is that I would find it interesting if we consider fostering open science in the broadest sense possible. So we keep continuing to talk about publishing stuff. And that is, so we had the opening statement by Etienne saying that we have an issue with fixation on quality, I think, or quantity, you said, but we also have a fixation on publishing. And I think the open science movement is actually trying to open up also what is considered a contribution to begin with. Would find it very helpful if we also can integrate that in the discussion. And I guess also maybe because I come from a more sociological tradition, I tend to look at systems instead of individuals, though I started studying psychology at some point, but I moved away from that. So I find it, for that reason, I also find it very strange and problematic that we continue to focus on bad apples versus, it's the same as this genius logic that we have in science. It's just individual genius logic. And the bad apples that we need to remove in order to fix stuff. Whilst I think the problem is much more systemic and needs to be addressed at a systemic level.
So, okay, great. I think this gives food to my moving on to the last block. I have to say I'm sorry because I haven't keep very well tight control of the timing, because I had to read and listen and keep track. So I was not used to this multitasking on the spot. So I think we are okay. But I want to move to sort of, I know we try to always, I try to avoid at least the topic of academia at large. But I think now maybe it's time to move to this sort of grander questions, although we were already discussing them. And I want to pose one last question about this is, it seems that transparency metrics like Curate Science perhaps are not unique in that they, like many other metrics, and many of our assessment as researchers is based on metrics of individual researchers. And so they put the responsibility of ensuring scientific validity and being socially responsible on individuals. So why not put pressure of open science or any other desiderata of science on institutions like publishers, but maybe publishers not only, but funders and our own universities? And so what is is an alternative to an individual metrics-based system is taking our institutions accountable, and what is the role of the individual researcher in making their institution accountable? How can we do this?
I guess I would just repeat myself. That's what we've been trying. I mean, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different initiatives and open science groups and badges and unending initiatives to try to change journals, to try to change universities, to try to change funders, and it's had only negligible increases in actual transparency when you actually measure transparency in these different fields. And it's based on transparent meta-scientific evidence, I might add. So you can go and check the data. So if you don't believe me that we're in a colossal transparency crisis, well, then go check the sources. And these meta-scientific studies do share their data. So you can check the data that reports on the transparency status of academia more broadly, right? And so that's again the impetus of trying something different, right? Like it seems like there's like how many decades are we gonna, how much longer are we gonna wait for universities to clean up their act and for funders to actually start doing this and for journals to start requiring this, right? So that's the impetus. So there might be other ways, but this is a different one, right?
So my question was more on the sense of sort of got a little bit lost on thought, but what is our what are the alternative to focusing on the individuals, and sort of, especially it seems that one of those options is to focus on institutions and collectives to try to change this. And so what is the role of individuals? How can we as individual peoples sort of commit to making our institutions accountable, transparent, or whatever sort of thing we value as positive?
Well, I think it is, you know, the institution has to think about the system and about the way people, the ways in which people are rewarded, the ways in which resources are being allocated. What is the signal that the institution sends to individuals? What does it value? When are you a good researcher? And I think at this stage there are a lot of problems in terms of the financial structures of universities. You know, this is all higher order, higher level, but they create problems because people are under a lot of pressure. A lot of people have untenured positions. They're vulnerable. And so I think at that level something has to change. I think that as researchers, and specifically researchers in a position of leadership, need to foster and encourage a climate where people are safe and feel, you know, and where, you know, are not punished for making mistakes or errors, or if the results, you know, turn out to be different than predicted. And, you know, you simply want to foster a culture where people, you know, share their data as much as possible. And that's something you can simply, you know, in a discussion, you can sort of set a norm and you can set an example. That's not very complicated, I think, if the structure doesn't punish people. If the structure doesn't put too much pressure on people. So I think it is at that level you can try to make more you know, systemic and cultural changes. But I think, you know, I get the impression, and I don't know, Etienne, where you work, but I get the impression that you know, you have this idea of researchers who are unwilling, you know, who are unwilling to share their data, who cut corners, and that's really not my experience. You know,
but
my experience is with a lot of researchers. Sorry?
Those are just the facts that are well documented. If you look at the number of fraud cases, the number of retractions, the number of papers that can't be reproduced, the number of papers with statistical reporting errors, the number of papers with internal consistencies in the tables, like the grim, like all these different aspects. This is well documented. And so
I think it is well documented, specifically in certain disciplines. This doesn't generalize, I think, across disciplines. It doesn't generalize.
No, that's
all
not
the
true. Everywhere we've looked, I mean, our job has been to organize the replication evidence across fields. Everywhere you look, whether it's marine science or ecology or anthropology or philosophy, experimental philosophy, social sciences, econ. I mean, everywhere we've looked, we found problems. So there could be edge cases. Of course, there's exceptions.
If you think that pure, you know, if you think that the fact that findings cannot be replicated is evidence for fraud per se, I think that's also
no, I didn't
problematic.
say that. No, I didn't.
But I think that changes can be made at the level of the system. But that requires you know, commitment also from the institutions to foster different.
But haven't we tried that for decades? Like, let's be honest, we've tried that. I mean, these groups have tried.
I don't understand who is the
Open Science Community, and
I don't know who the we've tried is, because
the meta-scientific field, right?
Sorry?
So you talk about the meta-scientific field, the leaders in meta-science and open science, like the Brian Noseks and Chris Chambers.
But Brian Nosek is not going to change the policies in my university.
institutions and universities.
But Diagnostic is not that powerful. He may think he's that powerful, but he's not that powerful that he on his own can change the policies of my institution, that he can change the financial structures of the Dutch government, the way science is being financed. So I don't know who.
So how much longer are we going to wait for institutions?
Sorry, I feel like there's some miscommunication about who the we is, certainly, and certainly about the locality and the globality of it all, because what happens in meta-science papers is indeed not what happens in local governments, like institutions like universities, but also national level. And I think that those are two different playing fields. And what we know, what we maybe describe in papers, all this sort of crisis that we might see are not necessarily information that can be simply sort of put to use in a very concrete policy making level. But so now I think Sarah had one last remark, and after this remark, I'm going to ask you to make closing statements, but if possible, keep them under 3 minutes, because I think a lot of things have already been said. So after Sarah's remark, I will ask also in the same order as before to give a closing statement.
Shall I just do both? So I say a couple of things and we consider that a closing statement?
That's fine.
To save time. Yeah, because I find your remark about what we can do as individuals to change the system very fascinating. And I was going to mention a couple of initiatives that also include indeed the meta science community, but I do think it's a concerted effort. So for instance, we saw with the Global Research Council, we did a survey among all the public funders that are associated with that, and whether or not they were moving towards more open science practices in their evaluations, and they are. So that's, I think, a good sign. There's also the initiative in the Netherlands, the Recognition and Reward Initiative in the Netherlands, in which you see a concerted effort by the institutions, the universities, the academic medical centers, and the funders, and the Royal Academy, that all say, okay, we should do this differently. And that does help. That gives a clear signal. Steering groups at local universities are now trying to translate those into practice. And we also need the research on research or meta-science community in the broadest sense, so including anthropologists as well, and whoever wants to join, to study these changes, to set up experiments and to further foster more responsible research practices at large. So I don't think we've tried and tested everything, and we're definitely not exhausting the options yet, and it is definitely a concerted effort. So that would be my closing statement. Back to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's thank you for pointing out to those initiatives, and especially to that's something I also wanted to that I was hoping that it will come up, which is this idea of being involved in policy and at the local level rather than at the publishing globally level. So now I would like to give the floor for Etienne for the last closing statement.
Great. So again, this quantity obsession has led to a very serious quality control problem in science, and the solution is to finally start measuring minimum transparency so that the quality control processes of science can take place, whatever those are in specific fields. And we're excited to continue working with community partners, and I should mention that we have formed partnerships that we will soon be announcing with community partners to continue to implement a transparency checking system for research and for researchers that are fair to all researchers in all fields and also minimizes unintended negative consequences. And so we're always seeking additional feedback. This is a platform built by the researchers for the researchers. And we are very excited to move forward. And from our perspective, this has to be attempted because, again, we're already being tracked by flawed metrics in a unprecedented, hyper-competitive environment. And so the natural progression seems to be to actually start measuring and tracking minimum transparency, doing it very carefully, of course, but we don't see any other options, or at least you have to try, right? So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, finally, the closing statement of Juliette.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think I'll repeat myself a little bit. I think individualized metrics are definitely not the way to go. They are unethical. They are invalid. They are as damaging, I think, to academia, as I said earlier, as the bonus culture is to banking. They don't solve the problems. They don't address the real problems at hand, and they distort behaviors and incite people to game the system. So I think it is turning our thoughts and efforts away from the issues that really need to address. And we've also seen elsewhere that this whole notion of auditing cultures, I mean, it hasn't helped prevent problems in the business world. Think about the big scandals. It will not solve our problems, either. So I think it is not the way forward. Actually, I think it's a major step backwards.
Okay, thank you. So there are quite a lot of questions and answers that I think we have to now sort out and give the speakers some time to make a coffee or a tea. And so I think 15 minutes should be enough. And so we can all have a rest. And then, so we will be back exactly at in 15 minutes at 5:15 if you're in Europe. And I am unclear about what time it is in Canada, but I guess it's early in the morning. But yeah, in 15 minutes. Thank you, everybody. Hi. So I've been looking at the questions and the comments. So there's some common threads and some common themes, and I think it's interesting because some we didn't touch upon on the debate itself. So I think it might be I sort of tried to group them a bit. And maybe I will rephrase some of them. So this one comes from Cohen Vermeer, who asked to Sarah and Juliette that metrics are so damn easy to use, also for individual researchers who are asked to evaluate their own colleagues for jobs, grants, and so on. So that even if we don't like them, we all tend to use them, right? If it suits us, because they are easy to use. And so says that looking at the journal impact factor is more convenient than reading articles from 100+ applicants in one job. So, and sometimes in peer review is not only something, for example, that happens when we evaluate papers, but also when we evaluate grants, each other's grants and each other's job applications. So what is our responsibility, and how can we avoid this? Ask Cohen, how can we avoid depending on data? Or if we do use this data, these metrics, how can we do it responsibly?
Yeah, so I'm probably not a very good example because I've always ignored metrics, and also when evaluating people's proposals or in job applications, and we tend to have a policy where we also ignore them for job applications. We ask applicants to send articles, and then we read those articles and we talk about the content of their research. So I've always tended to ignore the metrics because I don't think that I think that for librarians or for certain policymakers, they can contain useful information, but I think that as academics, we should be very careful about using them. And I understand that it might be tempting because it's in a sense efficient and it saves us time, but I think we need to be committed to not use them. And that's also a decision that you can make as a department to not include them in the way you evaluate people. So we've never included them in how we evaluate people, nor in how we evaluate candidates. And I think that that's also part of responsible research conduct, is how do you treat your colleagues, and what do you expect from them, and what is the standard and the norm that you set in that regard.
Great, thanks. That's a very concrete answer. Thank you. I think Sarah also wants to add something.
Yes, thank you. It's a really good question, and also I think Dora refers to this as one of the myths in research evaluation landscape. I guess one way to address this is to think about or redefine what it actually takes to do the job well. So what are you advertising for? And I can't imagine that it would only involve publishing. So what type of position are we actually putting on the market? Which tasks are involved? And what type of criteria can you then use to assess whether or not someone is a viable candidate? I'm not saying that this makes it easier, but it does make it more responsible. And I guess the question also brings to the fore this issue around how can we foster more responsible evaluation practices within people that are trained to do this differently. So foster this sense of accountability in faculty and staff, and that requires also training, I think, and also iterative feedback in research assessment processes. But that broader look, that bigger picture, that portfolio view, I think is a very important component of changing these practices toward more responsible uses of criteria, including some metrics. I'm not saying metrics aren't relevant, but they should be properly contextualized.
Right,
Okay, great.
and I would just add that, again, these minimum transparency metrics are seen as a minimum that allows you to then evaluate in more nuanced and context-based ways job candidates, for example. So when Juliette mentioned she ignores metrics and only reads papers, well, you still need to check the conflict of interest statements. You still need to check the data. So do you not check whether data are available? Because to me, if you're evaluating, and some universities are starting to do this, is to actually check whether for article types, for empirical article types, do the job candidates share their data, or do they have a valid reason not to share their data? So we're actually just trying to simplify something that you should already be doing when looking at job candidates. And again, this will happen.
That's not the type of simplification that I'm looking for. I'm looking at the broader picture. I'm looking at having a conversation with people. No, you try to reduce it to a simple metrics, but what we're doing is we have conversations with people and we ask them, how do you do your research? What are the methods that you use? That can also include questions about, do you pre-register? Questions about open access, but that's a topic for a conversation, not for a metric. I don't need the metric. I have conversations with people, and that's also how we set a standard or how we set a norm. I don't need the metric.
But if you know that the funder is requiring open data, unless there's an exemption,
I'm funded by the ERC.
So you're okay with hiring someone that's not upholding core ethical codes of conduct?
Sorry?
Are you okay hiring someone who's violating ethical codes of conduct from the funding agency? If
a person has not shared his or her data, doesn't necessarily mean that there's a violation of the code of conduct, right? It could,
if it's an empirical article type, yes. If the main contribution of a paper is empirical, then it is a violation of the code of conduct. No, it's not
necessarily a violation. And I don't treat people from the beginning as suspects. I treat them as colleagues with whom I have a conversation about how they do their research. So it's a different approach.
That's the due process. Assume innocence until evidence.
I'm sorry to hear that your experience in academia has been so negative that this has sort of colored your idea of what academics are and how they operate. But I treat people as equals, and I have a conversation with them, and I talk with them about how they do their research. And so I don't assume that by default what they're doing is unethical or is wrong or not well intended. That's just not how I. That's not my priori assumption.
That's great, but without minimum transparency, you won't be able to know whether they have integrity or whether they're cutting corners.
Well, I can ask them a question, right? I can ask them, "Do you share? Are you willing to share your data set?" That's if I review papers, I ask people to share their data set. I'm an editor of a journal. I ask people to share their data sets. It's a matter of asking questions, having a conversation, and then there's no problem.
Well, that's great. And I also assume that everyone is operating in good faith, but you still have to be aware that a lot of people are not acting in good faith, right? So you can't just ignore that and put your hand in
but there
are lots of bad faith.
This is a totalitarian logic. This is a totalitarian logic where you say people can't be trusted, so we need a policy.
In tax or finance, but maybe you can come back to that. But
so we're going to try to make this a bit more concrete, and so I wanted to go back to something that I think Sarah mentioned in passing, that you something about training and training about how to use responsible metrics. Is that what you were referring to? I just sort of was not sure what you were referring to.
Who are you speaking to? Sorry.
To Sarah.
Yes, I was not necessarily referring to training around only responsible metrics, but I think the question came from Koen around the issue of huge overflow of information and GIF as a sorting device. In, for instance, contexts in which you need to hire someone. And there's also something in the chat that also refers to that. So people send 2,000 CVs for a position. How do you then select? And I think one of the points I was making was about the criteria for a position that are probably not only related to publishing, but the other was about training evaluators to consider a broad set of criteria and to train them to look at a CV that is a more narrative, has a more narrative orientation, for instance. And to have conversations indeed as well, in which you both look at the research missions or the missions of an academic in the broadest sense possible, and then also to hard criteria that can back that up and make solid agreements about how someone will perform around those. Totalizing metrics at the individual level is the totally opposite of doing this. So it's a point about contextualization of information. Okay. And people need to be trained to do that, because we've not been trained to do that. So it's also an element of training and leadership.
But I wanted to ask about specific ways in which who is training, who's capable of doing this sort of training, and do you have any resources that you could point to people about sort of how to properly, or already how to think of your hiring process, how to think of making applications better, so application methods better?
One good resource is the DORA website. It has fantastic case studies of institutions and also funders that are trying to affect change, and also examples of how leadership courses are taking place. And there are some examples in the Netherlands of practices that are moving in that direction, but it's we're relatively at the start of that movement. For documentation, I would refer to the DORA website. Shall I put it in the link in the chat, because sure, that might be helpful to some of you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I take mostly from this past question is that there is power to be taken and decision making that is important at the very local level. So at the level of the department and at the level of hiring, in which people in positions of local power can do make a difference.
Yeah, there was this great quote by, I think, Marilyn Strathern that said something like, auditors are not aliens, they're versions of ourselves. Yes. We are also the ones sitting in on these committees, and we are all part of the funding landscape and the evaluation landscape and the hiring committees. So
yes, I think that's something important to bring up, that but when I say we, not me myself explicitly, but I can imagine that people at certain levels can both be evaluated and evaluator, and how we have a responsibility, especially when we are on the second group. Now I wanted to draw the attention to, there's like 3 or 4 questions about sort of how to think and about inequalities, for example, between the global south and the global north, and how to ensure equity in any sort of evaluations. So from YouTube, some Open Science TV asked the question about that we mostly talk about here our experiences in the global north, because all of us are here researchers at the global north. So this was, I think, mostly our topic of expertise. But how they were asking about how do we count for experiences from countries on the global north. And then another question related to this, well, at least this is, I related to it. Emma Ganley said that global equity is very important to consider for any sort of evaluations, and that rankings seem to be incompatible with this given massive inequality of available resources in different global locations. And so she asked, how can be this reconciled? And then someone else, I think, asked, what about if we buy into rankings and evaluations of individuals for a moment, and we normalize for field, for academic age? Could we alleviate those concerns? And for example, what about normalizing rankings precisely on the capacity of different institutions or of the country of origin? Would that be a way of leveling the playing field, do you think? Sarah has the hand raised. I know these are, no, you don't. Okay. I know that these are a lot of questions, both about what our thoughts on evaluating machines and metrics and the experience in the global south, and whether it's possible to normalize and to alleviate some of the inequality concerns by normalizing by income, for example. Do you think there's a chance to do something like this? Anybody has thoughts on this?
I think that does already happen in ranking practices. Normalization is quite a common technology to address some of these issues. But I think there's another point about the type of indicators and information used in rankings that are themselves very specific. They in themselves have marginalization effects. When we look at types of publications in English language, international journals, and citations around those, normalization doesn't help to address these issues. So it's also a matter of, I think, broadening out the set of criteria that we include. That's also probably not the entire picture, but I just wanted to point out that there's marginalization built in with the indicators that we currently use in rankings.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think actually there was a comment that I think perhaps was pointing into this direction by Jutta Heider, who I think we both cited. And she says that playing on the metaphor of leveling the playing field by the rankings, perhaps even using normalizing technologies, that this might not even work because she says it is defensible to put the obligation to do this work on the individual players while they are in the midst of playing the game. Also, what justifies the assumption that this leveling will not actually produce even more uneven distributions, as researchers based in well-resourced institutions clearly will have an advantage also there. So I think also tunes into this notion that normalization is also not a neutral tool.
Can I add a comment?
Yes, please.
So again, I think the opposite argument is justified, that minimum transparency is actually a good way to level the playing field. It's not going to create more inequities, because right now, the labs with more resources from higher prestige universities, they are mostly getting the jobs and the grants because funders and universities are just counting the number of publications and the journal impact factor. And that's really the unfair part. But with minimum transparency being tracked and being required, then that slows everyone down and increases quality, reducing quantity. And once you reduce quantity, then you actually level the playing field. Because as was alluded, like academia is a game, whether you see it or not that way, it's a game that you have to play within the existing incentive structure, which is quantity at the expense of quality, right? And so by tracking quality and tracking minimum transparency, then you are level the playing field. It's not going to reduce inequities. It's going to reduce inequities.
But
though time will tell. But again, time will tell. But there's basically no. I haven't heard, even in this debate or even in the millions of people on Twitter who are throwing us bricks, that no one has pointed out an actual valid fatal flaw with the substantive issues of actually checking the transparency of research and researchers. And again, this is going to happen whether you want it or not, and whether it's part of our organization or other organization. Actually, just today I got a message that the European Open Science Cloud is just launched a call for funding that almost describes Curate Science and the transparency rankings and the transparency tools to track open science practices. So this is going to happen whether we want it or not. And so it's better to be part of it and to help develop these systems so that they are fair and accountable. So you can just ignore it, but it's going to happen just like the quantitative metrics just happened. So universities started tracking quantity, whether you want it or not, and then it's led to colossal crisis.
Let's see what Juliette has to say about this.
Sorry?
No, let's see what you have to say about this.
Well, no, the fact that you simply assume that this is going to happen, and that you present it as if it's something inevitable. I can tell you this is not going to happen in my department under my watch. I'm not going to have individuals being monitored, through those kinds of individualized metrics. So you always make it sound as if it is a threat. This is going to happen. You have to adjust. You have to come. It's exactly the way that people from outside are trying to control academics. It's the taking away of the professional status of academics, where it is all about accountability, it's all about control. We can't apparently be trusted, we have to be monitored, we have to comply to those expectations, it's inevitable. No, I tell you, as a professional who values autonomy, it's not going to happen, not under my watch.
But the funders are already doing it. Actually, even Curate Science's grant was audited and checked whether we.
The funders are not going to tell. The funders at this stage are not saying you have to do this audit so that we can check how transparent you are. That's not the case. And in fact, the funders in the Netherlands are luckily moving away from the metrification in terms of how people are being evaluated.
And again, the minimum transparency is not the end goal. We didn't talk about that, but the Goodhart's law actually doesn't apply. Because transparency is not the end goal. Transparency is a minimum requirement to be able to play the game of science. It's actually the admission ticket to enter the arena of science.
Nobody is against sharing data in this discussion. The discussion is not about whether we should or should not share the data. The discussion is about whether you should have an individualized metric.
When you ask for data, it's less than 30%. So when you ask for data, you randomly email researchers and you ask for data, it's less than 30%. Share the data. So the facts don't align with your.
Maybe it depends on how you ask the question.
Maybe, but again, the facts are the data is not generally shared, and when you ask for it, it's not generally given. And again, when you talk about mistrust, it's the opposite. Minimum transparency is not going to lead to mistrust. It's going to actually lead to more trust, because now we can all say, okay, we're all meeting these minimum, very low standards, and now I can actually evaluate you and not assume that you're doing funny business. And this is the same in all other aspects of society. So like tax audits. Are you against tax audits? Are you against audits in the financial industry? And in fact,
all the audits in the financial industry haven't helped.
They're not even perfect. So in the IRS, in the US, you know how many people cheat on their tax? It's upwards of 20%, and they have random audits. So imagine if they did not have random audits, how much cheating there would be. So now bring that back to academia. We don't have checking of these minimum transparency standards. And we now know that there is bad research, opaque research, fraud, and rife throughout academia. So you can deny the facts, but this is a colossal crisis. And why would science, the profession of science, why would it be the only profession that does not have standards that are actually enforced? So it's like the law. If the police didn't enforce the law, then no one would follow it. Right?
Sorry, we're going to.
So are you against the police?
But Juliette had a brief comment about taxes under effectiveness.
Sorry, what did you say?
I feel like you had a brief fact about taxes and taxes audits under effectiveness.
Well, all the audits, I mean, if you look at the big scandals in the business world, Enron and they're numerous, companies that have been heavily audited, where there has been massive fraud. So this whole idea that with audits, we're going to solve the big crisis that, according to Etienne, is happening in academia. It's an illusion. It's an illusion to try to rely on audits rather and to externalize the motive to be open about the way you conduct your research. It should come from within, and I think there are many ways in which you can encourage people, by tapping into their intrinsic building onto their intrinsic motivation. You don't need the stick.
Okay, great, thank you.
Audits were created because of the scandal. So the Enron scandal, the WorldCom scandal, they actually led to increasing transparency in financial reporting. in terms of IFRS. And I had a friend who was a financial auditor, and I learned all about this. And then that's how I made the connection. Like, how come we don't have audits in academia? So actually, it's not true. They increased the financial transparency because of those scandals, and things are now better. Are they perfect? No, of course they're not perfect. There's still more advanced types of cheating, but at least we're raising the bar. We're increasing the quality. And again, we have different levels of standards, and you can keep raising the bar, but we need to have some kind of bar, or else, you're inviting this low quality research, which is worse than useless.
So, okay, those are big statements. So I want to move to something a bit concrete, which is the idea of minimal transparency. But I think this is not all something unique to Curate Science. I do want to emphasize this, which is the idea that open science is something that can be done by all. I think this clearly is not the case. And someone—
Can you clarify?
Yes.
Can you clarify why open science cannot be done by everyone?
So open access publishing is not something that comes at a free cost. And also someone here points to more this aspect, more in the terms of training. So Lars says, what is your position, not to you specifically, I guess to all, your position on the development of skills and competencies for open science? And my experience is that researchers are often so overloaded that the time it needs for them to obtain competencies for reproducible research, open data publishing, computational reproducibility, etc., is a barrier. So I think he's pointing to the idea that making good open science practices takes time, that for good data, good reproducible data, it takes time, it takes resources, and simply the fact that not everyone throughout all universities and all departments have the same amount of resources. So if our ability to commit to already practice that we could deem as beneficial, like open access publishing or reproducible data or sharing data, if those we know that they are not equally reachable by all, doesn't this pose a bias onto measuring them? Yes, Sarah?
Yeah, so I think this is a great point. And the key objectives of this UNESCO recommendation also point in this direction of promoting a more common understanding of open science to begin with, and also seeing how diverse paths may lead to it, but also developing an enabling policy environment for open science, which is also quite necessary. Investing in the infrastructures and services, because that is also unequally distributed. And investing in human resources, investing in education, digital literacy, and capacity building. All these things are required to actually foster more open science practices and the culture of open science. So yeah, I think I'm glad this was brought up by a person in the audience.
Etienne, do you have some thoughts on this?
Just a quick comment that yes, of course, doing science correctly takes a bit more time. And because of the quantity obsession, researchers don't have time for quality control. But I'd say that's just part of your duty as a scientist, is to take the time to make sure you're minimally transparent so that your research can be checked independently. So it's almost like saying, well, like a surgeon doesn't have time to calibrate his instruments, or like a pilot doesn't have time to go through his checklist to make sure everything's fine with the airline and the air. So we have, of course, it takes time. It takes a little bit more time to post your data and make sure everything's fine, but it's just a natural duty, and that's why we're trying to be as low and generous as possible, because we realize in this transition period, it's going to be a bumpy road, right? And so the best solution is to be choose the lowest, most generous transparency requirements, and to change the culture where you as an individual have to tell your university, I need more time for this training. I need more time, and make sure to convey to your department that you need more time to focus on quality rather than quantity, right?
Right. I'd say
I think
yes.
it is. I think it is surprising to see that somebody, tells me as an academic that the culture should change and develops a metric to apparently change the culture within, say, my team or my department or my school. So this is exactly my point at the beginning of my opening statement, where apparently, we as scholars cannot be trusted, and then we need to be subjected to these mechanisms of quantified control to change our culture. So people from the outside are trying to change the culture within my. I think that is quite shocking, to be honest.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. I'm doubting about which sort of topic we want to move to. I don't know if you have a question, any of you three that have seen in the Q&A that would like to address, or something new.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to quickly go over them because yeah.
Yeah, some of I am not going through because I feel like we already went through, but maybe perhaps I want to put more emphasis and deal down into why people don't do open science practices, and sort of at the end you do seem to frame committing to open science practices as a matter of individual sort of moral integrity, right? Like that's something you should do. It's about courage. It's about being sort of aggressively supporting open science, fight for noble causes and for principles. But it seems that those who do not commit to open science practice are somehow lacking moral integrity. But for example, publishing in open access is not about moral integrity. It's about having enough funding to pay for APCs. So that's something very clear, in which it's not about moral integrity. It's about being in a privileged position.
Well, yes and no, because green self-archived OA is part of the requirements, and that is almost always available to authors. So again, there might be tiny edge cases, but even then I would say it's your ethical duty, because again, if you hide behind a paywall, that means 99% of people in the world, including citizen scientists, cannot access the full text of your article, therefore cannot scrutinize your paper.
A paywall is not a matter of choice. Some people just do not have the resources to do something else rather than a paywalled journal.
No, because it comes down to the individual and basic principles. Again, scientific knowledge, copyright and science, it's like oil and water. Like it doesn't even make sense. The copyright is basically invalid for scientific content. And so it's the individual that has to say, no, I'm a scientist. In science, we need the broadest dissemination and broadest scrutiny possible. That's how science advances. So if you're not willing, whether it's because you don't understand or you don't feel like, breaking rules that are unethical and don't make sense, then it doesn't really matter. Your research, by definition, cannot be scrutinized by as many people. Therefore, it cannot withstand scrutiny. Therefore, it's less credible.
Did
so
you
there's no way around it.
Actually listen to what Max said? Because I get the feeling that you just don't listen to what's being asked, because your answer doesn't address the question.
How so?
Because I think Max said that not everyone can afford, even if they would want to. So this is the point about capabilities.
Okay, but my answer is that there are edge cases, and even my own cases.
What do you mean with
I violated copyright law so that my papers can be more accessible and so that people can scrutinize them. That's an individual choice. Of course, I'm violating copyright law, which is unethical by these greedy, evil publishers, but it's my choice, right? And so, again, if you want to do science, you have to follow the scientific principles. But if you're going to paywall your article for whatever reason, your science, therefore, cannot be scrutinized as much, right?
No, I don't
well,
think.
How so? No, it's not no. If
No,
your
it's really
paper
no.
is paywalled and I try to send it to a friend who's skeptical about a certain paper and they can't access it, then how is that science? So
for example,
if we disagree on that, then there's not much.
I'm not expert on this, but I feel like there's a case to be made against saying that this is external cases, marginal cases. So, for example, it is true that some publishers do waive the APCs for low-income countries, but low-income countries there's not so much research being done in low-income countries. And in fact, this doesn't attain middle-income countries. So there's a lot of middle-incomes that do not classify for fee waiving and still have to commit to paying APCs. And this includes European countries like Spain, Turkey, but it also includes countries in South America that some of them are considered middle-income countries, so they don't qualify for fee waiving APCs. And I think this is an issue that it's not as to say that it's simply marginal.
Right, but maybe I should clarify that the green self-archiving OA also includes non-copy edited. So that was something that we did change. So that can include a non-copy edited version of record, which to my understanding, it could be wrong, but I confirmed this with Chris Chambers. To my understanding, there's a very small minority of publishers who prohibit posting the non-copy edited version of your accepted manuscript. So that's my understanding, right? And that's what I mean by edge case, because we're talking about the non-copy edited version of the article. Is that clear?
Yeah, no, that's more clear. Now, I think we can move to another question, and I think it's also on the Q&A, and it's by Roland Ramthun, that says that so big publishers are changing into data analytics companies and sends a link, and that the resulting data is transformed into insights that are sold to university administrators and funders, so that the pressure of evaluation via some metrics will probably increase further for researchers in the next few years. So this is somehow, this is a projection that I think aligns, with the Etienne's projection that we like it or not, funders will use it, the data and metrics. In your opinion, I think he refers to the three of us. What would be an ideal position against this development, which still conceive research administrators and science policies and politicians when they have to distribute money? So yes, so how can we prevent? I know we already talked about our at local level, so when we are the hiring committees, but how can we position ourselves against this development at more higher level of science policy?
Yes, shall I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. This is a concern of mine as well. This is also why I was happy to join a task force that looked at, in the Dutch context, looked at the contract that was negotiated with Elsevier that combined read and publish with open science experiments that indeed move into this direction of, or potentially move in the direction of commercializing and further black boxing research intelligence, so information about research and researchers, and outsourcing that indeed role of those analytical tools and services to companies that might black box it. and that wouldn't be in the public interest. So the task force that I was part of also developed guiding principles for negotiating with commercial or third-party providers of data and research intelligence. I can also put that link in the chat. And I think it's a crucial example of indeed an effort that should be not at the individual level, but at the national level and institutional level. So that is something that requires a concerted effort of universities and funders in the Netherlands, but I also think more broadly. So we've also written recommendations, and one of them is to work towards an open knowledge base. I can also put that in the chat. So that would also build towards a more open infrastructure for information about research that would be available for use in multiple ways, but not to outsource that to others. It's information from universities and from researchers by universities and by researchers.
Thank you. I'm just reading here a few more other questions, but yes, if you could share the link, that'd be great. So I need to read them to assess them a bit.
Maybe I can add something that we haven't yet talked about, which are the selfish advantages of meeting minimum transparency, which is another angle we're considering, because most researchers are rational. And so if you tell them that sharing your data boosts your citations, then that can also help them to justify taking the extra time to do the right thing. And there's actually several ways to pitch that to researchers. And of course, a counterpoint could be, oh, but now you're going to be chasing impact. Do we want to be chasing impact? And I would say, again, that's kind of an inevitable part of the digital world. And impact is going to be tracked, though I agree impact metrics need to be vastly improved and be more nuanced to diverse outputs, like article types that don't have data. But again, without minimum transparency, impact metrics are a liability, because it's literally saying you're having an impact on the research community and or the public, but your research is not even verifiable and independently checkable, right? And so impact metrics without minimum transparency is a liability. So the solution is to have minimum transparency metrics so that then the impact metrics, you are accountable for your impact as a researcher.
So I think thank you. I think it's time maybe perhaps that we start closing as I think it's almost time. I just want to draw to another, it's a comment more than a question by Jeroen Bosman. So he says that in his country, in the Netherlands, they have been quite successful in pushing open access levels up to 75%. So that gives quite a lot of room for I think hope. But it's good to point out that in the Netherlands there has been quite a lot of institutional support to make open access a possibility, and it has not done by. He points that it has not been done by incentivizing individual people, by making it easy and paid for. And also by not giving against the prestige rankings of journals. So there has been a lot of institutional support and not by incentivizing individuals. So he says that while this is not a ranking of individual, it does indirectly affect the possibility of individuals to gain prestige, precisely because although they are in a country where it's made easier for them to publish in open access, to compete to open science practices and so on. Their prestige increases not directly, but indirectly. He says, this is not a question in itself. I wonder whether rankings of institutions, journals, etc., while not ranking people, can have the same negative effects and cause harm to individuals. Precisely, so even if we talk about, okay, metrics and rankings should be based on institutions, not on individuals, whether this can backfire, even if it's indirectly by the use of rankings at the institutional level. And so I just wanted to sort of close with this. I don't know if any of you has anything to say as closing that is new. And I think we sort of understood each other's position. Anyone wants to take the floor once again?
I mean, I just on your point is that once you can measure and track minimum transparency of research, you can then do it at all levels and then leverage these intergroup comparisons across universities, across journals, across nations, across funders. So you could be able to say, oh, look, this department actually has, most of the researchers in this department do meet minimum transparency standards. Therefore, maybe I want to join that. And if I had that in grad school, I would have used that to make sure that I enter a department that values minimum transparency. Right. And of course, I discovered what I discovered was not the case. And so we can leverage these rankings at all levels. And again, as long as they are valid and validated, and that the entity doing this is accountable, then that will be progress.
I think it will be a totalitarian utopia, but
okay, I think we close with this, with progress and utilitarian utopia. Thank you for the three of us to sort of think. For me and for the team, this was also an experiment on itself, of sort of trying to bring experts from different corners to try to talk about this topic. I think we could have broadened this much more. I think we, of course, we're very focused on the global north, but I think that's where at least our expertise resided. But of course, there are questions that are applicable and at least different in other areas of the world. But I think I do take some key messages, and I think at least one is that action is possible, and that action at the local level is definitely possible for those who have certain power. But I think it shouldn't be a power to further our own instances, but also to commit to our own community in a fair and responsible manner. And I think also, I think something that we didn't talk, and I wish we could have had here someone, not a scientist themselves, but someone who actually does policymaking, because I think this is some of the bridge that I think at some point we pointed out that there's this seems to be a gap between maybe people who work on science issues and who are worrying about these issues, and scientists themselves, but sometimes the national policies and international policies don't align with the descriptions of what the situation is. So I think next time we would certainly have to explore this gap between science and policy. And I think with this, I think we can conclude. Thank you to all three. I think it was very interesting. And thank you to the audience. I hope that by participating, not by showing, but by writing, you felt part of the discussion. So thank you for participating.
Thank you, Max. You did a great job.
Thank you very much.
To manage.
thank you.
Thank you to all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.